Hi, I'm Cynthia Haney, the toolmaker behind Cynthia Wood Spinner, and the subject of today's YouTube demo is learning how to measure the wraps per inch of your yarn and learning how to use a wraps per inch tool to take that measurement. And of course, what on earth will we do with the number once we get it? So to get started, let's talk a minute about wraps per inch. Wraps per inch is the number of times you can wrap a yarn around an object side by side the strands, or around anything, in a 1 inch space. So it's how many strands are going to lay next to each other in a 1 inch area is your wrap per inch number. The larger the number, the thinner the yarn. The smaller the number, the thicker the yarn. And it helps you sort your yarn, particularly hand spun or something without a ball band, into size categories and helps compare it to a pattern to figure out if this yarn is the right one for the pattern. Kind of a test before you get as far as making a gauge swatch. As well as if you're making hand spun yarn, it is great for figuring out if you're staying consistent with the yarn you're trying to make as you're working throughout a project. So that's what wraps per inch is. But what about the tool? So this is my wraps per inch tool, and it works better if I hold it for you right side up. That is right side up now? Yes, that's right side up now. Sorry. And the reason my wraps per inch tool is so unusual is because I've worked hard to design it with the aid of a couple local spinners. Shout out of thank you to Kim and Mary Ann and Marla in particular, who have given me a great deal of insight and feedback as we've worked through many prototypes to get this made correctly. The idea being that when you're measuring the wraps per inch of your yarn, you want to be rolling the yarn around your tool so that you're not adding or subtracting twist. If you think for a minute of yarn like a crepe paper streamer or a toilet paper, because we're a little more familiar with that, if you roll it, it stays flat and it doesn't get all twisty, whereas the streamers in particular, if you pull them out of the middle and you just pull up instead of off the side, it ends up getting all spiraled, which makes for good decoration. But measuring yarn, if you change the amount of twist, you change the thickness of the yarn. And of course, you've changed the yarn itself for, particularly if you're measuring hand spun in progress, you don't want to mess up your yarn as you're doing it. So that's why the tool's round. There are many other features of it, and we're going to go from thick to thin in our use of it today. Starting out, I have some relatively, for me, thick hand spun yarn. And this tool has 3 portions to it. We have the 2 inch portion, the 1 inch portion, and the 1/2 inch portion. When you're measuring a thicker yarn, the 2 inch measure will give you a more accurate result than one of the smaller ones. And yes, we have to do a tiny bit of math at the end, but it allows us to have a larger sample to get a more consistent measurement. The reason for this weird mouth-looking part of the tool is it gives us somewhere to grab the end of the yarn to help secure it as we get started. These little notches between the measures are both an attempt to help you get a crisp start so you know really where the beginning is, but also it's a good visual if you're counting as you wrap. It lets you know when you've turned a full revolution. So we're going to just roll the yarn onto the tool, and this is thick enough it doesn't much want to stay in that guide notch for starting in place, but you just gently roll, keeping that end out of the way, the yarn beside itself on the measure. You don't want it totally smushed tight because you're compressing it, but you don't want, a whole bunch of dead space or open space between it. So just hold it next to itself. And as you see, this was not the most consistent thick yarn of mine here. And make sure you're not having to put too much tension on it as you roll either. This yarn's already in a ball, so I had to pull out some more from the ball. But as you're, stay on camera, as you're winding, you can notice those differences, and differences like those thickness variations can really make a very noticeable change in your measurement. So having a bigger sample here is better. And I'm just going to wrap a little thicker because you don't really, or a little quicker because you don't really want to spend all day watching me wrap. And get just a little bit more to get to the end here. And we have a reasonably well wrapped 2-inch measure going on here. So regardless of exactly how you started or stopped, make sure when you do your counting, sorry, I keep dropping below the camera, my apologies. When you go do your counting, that you're not at that half started point, because if you're kind of right in here, you're not going to get quite as accurate a measure. So I'm actually going to look at the back of the tool essentially right now. So I have complete wraps across, and we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 wraps in the 2 inches, because we're on the 2-inch measure. So of course we divide by 2, giving us 8 wraps per inch. And this is a relatively thick yarn on the bulkier side with that measure. And so then we can compare that to our pattern. We can compare that for the common names for how thick a yarn is. And we can, of course, compare that to if I were to try and spin more yarn to match this, I know how thick I need to end up making it. So that's using it for the 2-inch measure. And if you're doing it super precise as you're making yarn, you would actually unroll it. But I didn't, like I said, I didn't want to take all day on you. Now the 1-inch measure, we're changing yarn sizes here. Same idea. And to work in the middle of the tool, you can either go ahead and still use the mouth to secure the end and just come all the way over here to the 1-inch measure, or you can tie a simple knot in one of the sections you're not using to secure your end and go from there. And anytime your yarn's a thickness that it just doesn't quite work with either attachment point, because we have one more attachment point to show you, the knot is a very simple way to go. And the reason we have concave spots between the measures here is it just is a little more comfortable on your finger. So again, we're gonna wind. Yes, there we go, winding. Loosely, but not too loose, beside itself, not too much tension on it. And got to take some care that we're not unwinding, which is the only disadvantage if you tie the knot. And we'll tidy that up in a minute, or just kind of slide that back over. Keep coming, keep coming. This is some very common commercially spun cotton, like most people use for dishcloths. There we go, we got that. Yeah, I'm pleased with that spacing, not too tight, not too loose. And the key here is being consistent in your own measuring. So however tight or loose you measure your wraps per inch, if you're always the same way, any natural variation of how much we squish in there will stay consistent within your results. So here we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 wraps, and no math because we're in the 1-inch measure. So a thinner yarn than the last one we showed. And there's one more measure, and reason for the one more measure, which I will show you in just a second here. The final measure is specifically intended for when you're measuring something very thin. Because when you're measuring something very thin with wraps per inches in the 20 and up range, you really don't want to be taking the time, particularly well over 20 wraps per inch, to wind that many times around in the 1-inch measure. So that's why we have the 1/2-inch measure. And I actually have a piece of sewing thread here. This is a thicker sewing thread, but sewing thread, because at the moment I don't have many singles yarns or plied yarns that are on hand and not tied up in projects that are of this thickness. So the reason we have this hole on the end is, one, it's great for securing a thin yarn to start, just like the mouth on the other end. And the alternate is you can put a tie here and hang this off of your spinning wheel or your basket or whatever, so you don't lose it. Because yes, I have sold a few replacement wrap per inch tools when they got lost. So I stuck the end of the yarn through, and it works better if you stick it through so that it's going, the tail is opposite of where the little starting notch is. And then this would be easier if I turned everything around and took advantage of my natural handedness. There we go. So, and then just like before, we're going to wrap and wrap. And if you manage to keep a finger on it at the starting notch as you start, this goes much better when you're not trying to fiddle on camera. So my apologies. And this is a little bit thinner than you would really be using, although it certainly can be that thin, because I have spun this thin, which is why I grabbed this for an example. Here we go. Are we finally getting going? There we go. Yes. And once you get going, it behaves beautifully, but that first little bit can be a bit fiddly. And once again, stay on camera, gal. Okay. So we keep wrapping and wrapping and wrapping, and you get the idea. And this time when we finally wrap, 2 points to note. When you're wrapping this thin, it is very handy to count from your starting guide notch how many times around you go, rather than having to see and count the individual strands afterwards. That's totally personal preference. You might count as you go and double check, whichever you want. But when you finally get to the end, you do need to multiply the total by 2 to get the actual wraps per inch. And I have spun some very, very, very high wraps per inch yarn before, so there is a need for this measure, but it's not a need for everybody, which is why, I give you 3 choices on the tool. So that's a little bit about wraps per inch. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments and I'll get back with you. I have them available on my website, thecynthiawoodspinner.com, in the store under specialty tools, and then wrap per inch, you'll find them. There's also an alphabetical listing of items, which can help when you're after things. This particular one is black wool, just showed up well on camera today. I have them in cherry and maple and a variety of woods, and I can make you custom ones as desired. Some of them are a little thicker diameter, some of them are thinner. It's all a matter of what piece of wood I used. And I hope this was some useful information for you today. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for watching this on the replay. Like I say, leave me a comment anytime you want, and I will let you get on with your day. Thank you very much.